Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. In this video, the entire story of Socrates, from his youth on the streets of Athens to his final day in prison, how he became the most troublesome man in the city, why he was put on trial, and what he said before drinking the poison. We will explore his ideas, his friends, his enemies, and how an ordinary Athenian became a symbol of conscience for all time. This is not just a biography. It is a story about what it means to live and not betray oneself. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. Socrates was born around the year 470 before our era in Athens, in the deme of Alopece, a suburban district within Attica. At that time, Athens had not yet been fully recognized as the hegemon of Hellas, but was already gaining strength and fame after the victory over Persia in the Greco-Persian Wars. It was a time of recovery, construction, and rapid growth, when Athenian democracy was just beginning to gain weight, and the future flourishing of art and philosophy could already be felt in the air. Socrates' father, Sophroniskes, was, according to tradition, a stonecutter, or by another version, a sculptor. His mother, Phaenarete, worked as a midwife, a respected profession in Athens that required experience, calm, and precision. A midwife not only assisted at childbirth, but also provided basic medical care for women. Later, Socrates would often compare his philosophical practice to his mother's craft, saying that he helped souls give birth to truth, just as a midwife helps to bring a child into the world. The family was poor and apparently did not belong to either the aristocracy or the political elite. Socrates received the traditional education of an Athenian boy: literacy, music, physical training, and the basics of ethics. Like other youths, he attended the Palestra, a school that combined intellectual studies with gymnastics. The Athenian system of upbringing was built on the ideal of kalokagathia, the unity of physical beauty and moral virtue. Though Socrates would later become the symbol of its opposite, his youth was formed within this very ideal. Athens of those years was lively, noisy, full of contrasts. In the streets, one could hear merchants arguing about the price of wine or olive oil, the shouts of boys playing ball, the songs of rhapsodes reciting Homer. The city was still being restored after its destruction by the Persians in the year 480 before Christ, when the Acropolis had been burned. It was precisely in Socrates' childhood that the reconstruction of the sacred hill began, the building of temples that would later become the symbols of classical Athens. Architects and artisans worked on temples, porticos, and statues of the gods. Phidias, the great sculptor, returned to the city and was entrusted with creating the cult statue of Athena Parthenos. We can imagine young Socrates visiting the construction sites, watching how columns rose above stone bases, how the faces of gods emerged from marble blocks. Perhaps he helped his father in the workshop, carrying tools, preparing materials, learning to handle the hammer and chisel. Later in life, he would often use the language of crafts: carpenter, shoemaker, builder, those whose wisdom comes from precision and experience, not from lofty speeches. Physically, he was strong and resilient. Although later ancient writers noted his ugliness, the flat nose, broad lips, protruding eyes, in his youth he clearly endured physical challenges well. Like all Athenian men, he had to prepare for future military service. Every young citizen faced 2 years of ephebia, military training. Yet, unlike his peers, Socrates showed no desire for competition, no dream of glory as an athlete or politician. Even in youth, he revealed what Xenophon and Plato would later call his daimonion, the inner voice that restrained him from rash acts. He was often silent, contemplative, watching long before speaking. Some teachers found him stubborn, for he would not accept explanations on faith, but kept asking clarifying questions. Athens was changing rapidly. Democracy was taking root, elections, citizens' courts, the People's Assembly, all became inseparable parts of civic life. More Athenians engaged in public affairs, voting, attending trials, studying rhetoric. The first public schools appeared, teaching the art of persuasion. Many young men aspired to political careers, dreamed of becoming orators, sought the favor of the demos. Socrates did not follow that path. He showed no interest in rhetoric for the sake of power. From early on, he could sense falseness in words, hollow ornamentation without substance. He was more intrigued by asking what justice was than by learning to convince others of anything. These qualities were not yet a system of philosophy, but they revealed his inner nature, a slow, careful mind, attentive to detail. Perhaps the most important thing was that he grew up in Athens at the very moment a unique intellectual atmosphere was forming. Traveling thinkers, the so-called sophists, were arriving, offering paid lectures and discussions. Citizens were beginning to ask questions about human nature, the state, the soul. All this, at first alien to the boy from a humble home, would gradually become the core of his world. For now, Socrates remained a shadow amid great change, growing up without wealth, noble ties, or ambition. Yet within that humble beginning, amid the sound of hammers, the murmur of the agora, and the voices of poets and early rhetoricians, something new was forming. A man who would be neither general, nor legislator, nor poet, yet would influence all generations to come, as if standing at the very foundation of thought itself. When Socrates reached adulthood and completed his obligatory ephebia, he became, like every Athenian citizen, part of the military levy. In 5th century before Christ Athens, military service was a civic duty. It tested endurance and courage and fostered a sense of belonging to the polis. According to the surviving accounts, Socrates took part in 3 campaigns: at Potidaea in the year 432 before Christ, at Delium in the year 424, and in the Boeotian expedition. He fought as a heavily armed hoplite with spear, shield, and armor. In the campaign at Potidaea, as Plato recounts in the Symposium, Socrates displayed extraordinary endurance and composure. Alcibiades, then a young admirer, recalled how Socrates stood motionless for hours, lost in thought, how even in severe cold he went barefoot and needed no extra cloak. While the camp slept, he would remain awake, reflecting, until dawn brought resolution. In battle, too, his steadiness was remarkable. During retreats he never panicked, never broke formation, moving calmly and giving courage to those beside him. At the Battle of Delium, where the Athenians were defeated by the Boeotians, he again showed restraint and prudence. Xenophon later claimed that Socrates had helped him escape danger, though Xenophon was likely too young to have fought there. The tale, therefore, reflects Socrates' reputation rather than literal fact. But it is well attested that his behavior in battle was exemplary. He neither rushed forward recklessly, nor retreated without reason, combining caution with unshakable composure. When he returned from the campaigns, Athens was transforming. The city was at its cultural height, and with it came a philosophical and political awakening. In the agora and gymnasia, sophists, itinerant teachers of wisdom such as Protagoras, Gorgias, Hippias, and Prodicus, taught rhetoric and the art of persuasion for pay. Protagoras was famous for saying, "Man is the measure of all things," while Gorgias exalted speech as the supreme power to move the listener. These men were fashionable. Ambitious youths flocked to them, seeing their lessons as tickets to political success. Socrates, it seems, attended their talks, asked questions, and observed, but he quickly realized that his own aims were different. He saw how easily the art of speaking became the art of evading truth. He rejected the idea that any opinion could be defended if one simply mastered technique. Instead of learning to argue, he began learning to ask, and to seek answers that rested not on eloquence, but on logic and moral sense. Around this time, he also encountered the ideas of natural philosophers. The echoes of Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Anaxagoras reached Athens. Of these, he was especially drawn to Anaxagoras, who claimed that nous, mind, was the ordering principle of the cosmos. Socrates had hoped to find in Anaxagoras a moral explanation of human behavior through divine reason, but found instead only physics, explanations of wind, ether, and rotation. He was disappointed. He sought the why, but found only the how. That realization marked a turning point. Socrates began to understand that true knowledge concerns not the heavens, but humanity. He became preoccupied not with why the seasons change, but why people choose between good and evil. He asked, "What is justice? What is virtue? Can goodness be taught? Who truly knows what is right?" Gradually he withdrew from pursuits that brought money or status. He gave up his craft, ignored politics, and lived for conversation. Not for gain, but for understanding. He spoke with artisans, merchants, youths, officials, poets, anyone willing to talk. He sought not ready answers, but the stripping away of illusions through questions. He never called himself a philosopher. The word was only beginning to take shape. But he became the man who placed the human being, the thinking, doubting, questioning self, at the center of attention. That, in turning from rhetoric, physics, and politics toward the inner world, was Socrates' path to philosophy. By the time he reached about 50 years of age, he was already a familiar figure in Athens, not as a teacher in the usual sense, nor as a writer or expert, but as a man whose silence unsettled and whose questions disarmed. It was then that he entered fully into the role that would make him a legend. In his mature years, Socrates became a constant presence in Athenian life. He had no school like the sophists, no house for pupils, no written lectures, and no fees. He did not invite, he simply approached. Each day he appeared where life was most vivid, in the agora, among the workshops, near the gymnasia. He would approach someone and begin to speak. He was easily recognized, barefoot, simply dressed, calm and quiet until he began to talk. He might address a stranger at random and ask, "What is justice? What makes a man good?" Or, "You say this is right, but why?" He asked not to argue or to prove superiority, but to understand how the other person thought. That was his method. He never claimed to know the truth. On the contrary, he began with the admission of ignorance. His phrase, "I know that I know nothing," was no affectation. It reflected his belief that only those aware of their ignorance can begin to learn. He listened intently, often in silence, then gradually probed deeper. Each answer led to a new question, until what once seemed obvious unraveled completely. This mode of dialogue would later be called the Socratic method. Socrates himself called it meutic, the art of midwifery. Just as his mother helped women give birth, he helped others give birth to thought. But this required questions, patient, precise, sometimes painful. He offered no ready answers, imposed no doctrine, but guided the other person toward insight. Irony was one of his favorite tools. He often began by pretending ignorance, asking naive questions, requesting clarification. Yet by gently exposing contradictions, he revealed flaws in reasoning. His speech was plain, unadorned, free of oratorical flourish, and for that reason devastating, especially to the self-satisfied. He could speak with anyone, a cobbler about craftsmanship, a soldier about courage, a poet about inspiration, an official about justice, and in every conversation returned to the same theme. What makes a human being truly wise and virtuous? He sought no success, no political influence, no public office, but everyone knew him, admirers and enemies alike. He especially challenged the sophists, those who taught eloquence for pay. He did not despise them personally, but he believed their method led away from truth. They taught how to win arguments, not how to understand, how to speak beautifully, not to think deeply. For Socrates, truth mattered more than persuasion. One could not, he said, teach virtue as one teaches reading. Virtue was not a formula, but a constant inner work. The sophists sensed danger, for Socrates could, with one quiet conversation, destroy a man's reputation. He sought no fame, took no money, built no following. He simply walked to people, to thoughts, to questions. One story told by Plato describes how Socrates spoke with Euthyphro, a man sure of his piety. Socrates asked what pleasing to the gods truly meant, and soon Euthyphro found himself unable to explain the boundary between virtue and arbitrariness. Or his talk with Meno, where Socrates showed that even the concept of virtue falls apart when we try to define it precisely. Or the famous Apology, where before the court he declared that his whole life had been devoted to a divine mission, to question men and test whether they really know what they claim. Not everyone understood him. Some left irritated, others returned, thoughtful. Some began with hostility but grew to respect him. Others, feeling exposed, came to hate him. His method was dangerous. It stripped away illusions, demanded effort, and offered no comfortable refuge. He never gathered pupils, but youth flocked to him. They came not because he promised answers, but because his listening was attentive and his silence meaningful. He did not seek followers, but inspired thinkers. He said that his calling came from an inner voice, a daimon, that restrained him from false steps. He did not march against the crowd, nor with it. He walked beside it, asking questions. And so, day after day, in the same streets, beneath colonnades, amid the hum of markets, beside temples and courts, he spoke, not for glory, not for power, not for a school, but for one purpose, that even one person might stop and wonder, what am I doing? And why? Socrates never called himself a teacher, never kept a school, never gathered pupils in the Athenian sense. He did not pass on knowledge as a doctrine, and did not claim authority. Yet there were those who returned, who were drawn to him, who felt that thinking changed in his presence. These people did not always call themselves his pupils, but they remained, as memory, as voices, as a continuation. One of the most paradoxical and dazzling young men around Socrates was Alcibiades. Born into a noble family and raised in the house of Pericles, he possessed looks, charm, eloquence, and ambition that could have brought him anything he desired. He met Socrates in youth, and the encounter was so powerful that in Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades would compare the philosopher to a satyr who, by conversation alone, destroys everything a person believes. He confesses that Socrates was the only man before whom he felt shame, neither before the people's assembly, nor before soldiers in camp, nor before mighty allies did he feel what he felt beside this man. He tried to draw Socrates into intimacy, but the philosopher refused, saying he would not trade wisdom for a body. Alcibiades did not understand. He went away, into politics, into war, into treachery, into flight. Yet even years later, when fame and disgrace pressed on him from every side, he remembered Socrates as something that stayed with him forever and that he never fully overcame. Plato's attitude was entirely different. He was more than 40 years younger than Socrates and first met him as a mature and recognized philosopher. Of aristocratic birth and well-educated, interested in poetry and science, he abandoned verse after meeting Socrates and devoted himself to philosophy. He became the one who would preserve Socrates' image for history. Plato did more than record dialogues. He created a philosophical form in which Socrates' voice became inseparable from the search for truth. He wrote that Socrates never asserted, only asked, hence the form of dialogue, where no voice is final. In the early works, such as the Apology, Credo, or Euthyphro, Socrates remains as close as possible to the historical figure. In later works, like the Republic or the Phaedo, he becomes the bearer of Platonic philosophy. Yet even there, Socrates is not a monument but a man, calm, ironic, steadfast, inwardly free. Another crucial witness to Socrates' life was Xenophon. A soldier, memoirist, and participant in Cyrus the Younger's campaign, he was far from Plato's dialectic yet deeply respected Socrates. In the Memorabilia, he portrays him as a mentor, firm, practical, restrained. Xenophon's Socrates is not a demolisher of others' notions but an advisor and example. The descriptions are simpler, at times more naive than Plato's, yet they breathe genuine admiration. Thanks to these two authors, so different, we see two sides of one person, Socrates the philosopher and Socrates the man. Among those near him in the final years stands Crito. He was Socrates' contemporary, perhaps older, and remained at his side. In the dialogue bearing his name, it is Crito who urges Socrates to flee prison. He proposes bribing the guards, arranging an escape, taking him to Thessaly. Socrates refuses, not from fear of consequences, but because he believes that acting against the laws would betray himself. Crito does not argue. He listens, understands, consents. He stays with him to the end. In the Phaedo, we meet another participant, Apollodorus. He is emotional. He weeps. He loses self-control. People called him naive, even foolish. Yet he, like Plato, remained with Socrates on the day of the execution. He did not try to argue. He simply was there. He remembered. There were others. Antisthenes, later regarded as a forerunner of the Cynics, Phaedo, Chaerephon, Socrates' childhood friend mentioned by both Plato and Aristophanes. Each carried away something of his own from their encounters. Some founded schools. Some vanished. Some passed on only a name. But almost everyone who was close to him became a link in the chain by which Socrates' image reached posterity. Not all received him with admiration. Some sensed a threat in him. He spoke in such a way that people lost confidence. He shattered the familiar. He affirmed nothing. Yet his questions had a firmness one could not evade. He did not provoke, yet he provoked. He did not debate, yet he exposed weakness. Some were merely irritated. Some hated him. He was deemed dangerous, especially by those who feared exposure. He undermined authorities without becoming an authority himself. He dismantled knowledge without offering a ready replacement. He was, and that alone was enough to remain in memory as the stone over which thoughts stumble. But there were also those who said nothing, who simply listened, simply remembered, who carried with them one thought, one phrase, one feeling, that thinking matters, that understanding is harder than appearing, that being honest with oneself is more difficult than being honest before others. Socrates spent his whole life in Athens, a city that, during his years, knew not only cultural flowering and political might, but also military defeat, tyranny, and the arduous restoration of the Republic. He watched the city change, saw the crowd become judge and lawgiver, saw decisions of life and death made in the agora, saw glory give way to downfall. He saw how easily public opinion lifts one man and casts down another, and this shaped in him a restrained, if not skeptical, attitude toward democracy. He was not an enemy of popular rule, yet he did not consider it ideal. He did not revolt against the city's order, but he did not keep silent when truth and justice yielded to the will of the many. His reflections carried the thought that governing requires knowledge rather than numbers, that the crowd can err, that voting does not replace reasoning. He did not reject democracy, but he refused to swear loyalty to a majority acting unjustly. And although he did not engage actively in politics, did not stand for office, did not write speeches, did not address the people, there were moments when his civic stance became visible and firm. One such moment occurred in the year 406 before our era, after the naval battle of Arginusae, when the Athenian fleet defeated the Spartans. Many Athenian sailors perished, and the commanders, despite victory, failed to organize rescue because of a rising storm. On returning to Athens, 8 surviving generals were put on trial. Public indignation was great. Families of the dead demanded justice, and demagogues demanded punishment. Before the trial came a session of the Council of 500. At that time, Socrates, serving as one of the 50 Prytanes, faced a choice between submitting to the majority's will and upholding the law. He refused to put to a vote an illegal motion to try all 8 generals in a single mass verdict without individual consideration. The refusal aroused anger, threats, and pressure, but Socrates did not yield, even knowing his disobedience could bring consequences. His conduct remained in memory as an example of civic steadfastness when the many demanded blood. A few years later, Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, and in the year 404 before our era, the city fell under a tyranny, the rule of the 30, an oligarchic group installed with Spartan support. Among them was Critias, once close to Socrates, one of his former associates. The new regime acted harshly: executions without trial, confiscations of property, exile of dissenters. Citizens were stripped of rights, and the very idea of justice was reduced to obedience. Socrates did not support the regime. He took no part in its affairs and held no office. Most telling is the episode of Leon of Salamis. One of the 30 ordered Socrates and 4 other Athenians to go to Leon's house and bring him in, clearly to his death. Socrates, receiving the order, did not argue, did not mount resistance. He simply did not obey. He turned and went home. The others carried out the command. He did not. It was a silent act, without display or political speeches, yet it revealed his essence. He would not act against conscience even when ordered by power. He risked his life. Tyrants did not forgive disobedience, but he was not touched. Perhaps because of personal ties, perhaps because of circumstance, perhaps because he posed no danger to the regime. The act, however, was not forgotten. When, a year later, democracy was restored, Athens passed an amnesty forbidding prosecutions for deeds done under the 30. The city wanted to forget, to forgive, to move forward. Yet the air remained tense. Fear, suspicion, and exhaustion made citizens wary of anything outside the norm, and Socrates was outside it. He made no public declarations, yet his conversations did not cease. He did not agitate, yet his questions continued to expose the emptiness of official formulas. He was no politician, yet his conduct reminded everyone that a citizen is not one who merely votes, but one who thinks, not the subject of the crowd, but a person of conscience. Moreover, people could not forgive his circle. His tie to Alcibiades, who betrayed Athens twice, and to Critias, who became one of the most ruthless tyrants, was taken not as coincidence, but as a sign. People began to see in Socrates a source of decay, influence, doubt. He called no one to revolt, yet it seemed he created the conditions in which revolt was only a matter of time. Socrates did not react. He did not justify himself. He did not strive to be understood. He continued to walk the city, to stop, to talk, to ask. He lived as he always had. But now the city looked at him differently. In the spring of the year 399 before our era, Socrates was about 70 years old. Athens at that time lived in wounded calm. The Peloponnesian War had ended in defeat. The regime of the 30 tyrants had left a mark of mistrust and fear. The restored democracy sought new stability. Citizens longed for order, predictability, and the preservation of tradition, and anything beyond the usual aroused anxiety. In such an atmosphere, Socrates came to be seen not as a philosophical curiosity but as a threat. The formal charge against him was brought by a citizen named Meletus, a young poet and little-known public figure. He was supported by Anytus, an influential leader among the Democrats, and Lycon, connected with the circles of rhetors and the theatre. Each, in his own way, felt aggrieved by the philosopher. Anytus as a man attached to traditional values, Meletus as a young zealot of religion, Lycon as a guardian of public morals. The indictment contained 2 principal counts: impiety, not honoring the gods whom the city honors, and introducing new divine powers, and the corruption of youth. Under Athenian law, these charges could entail the death penalty. This was not about private blasphemy, but about undermining public order. If a man educates youths in doubt, questions foundations, and speaks of an inner daemon instead of the city's gods, then he threatens the polis. The hearing took place in the Heliaia, the supreme people's court. The jury was large. By lot, 501 citizens were chosen. All were equal judges and at the end would cast their votes with pebbles, black for conviction, white for acquittal. The accusers spoke first. Meletus, on their behalf, asserted that Socrates' speeches rejected established worship, introduced unknown divine forces, and, most dangerously, eroded respect for elders, undermined authority, and fostered in young citizens a sense of superiority over the law. He claimed that youths, after hearing Socrates, came to despise their parents, mock customs, and, instead of taking part in public affairs, formed informal groups, philosophical circles suspect to the city's democracy. When Socrates' turn came, he mounted the bema and began his defense. It has reached us in Plato's record, the Apology of Socrates, and, as far as we can tell, much in it is close to the original. Socrates spoke calmly without pathos, refusing customary tactics. He did not bring children to court, did not beg for mercy, did not seek pity. He addressed each charge in detail. Regarding divinity, he affirmed that he believed in gods, only not necessarily in those of the myths and statues. He spoke of the daemon, an inner voice that warns him, restrains him from error. He saw no contradiction with the city's religion. Rather, he took it as a sign of divine reason. He reminded the jurors that the Delphic oracle, when his friend Xenophon asked who was wisest, pointed to him, to Socrates. Then he began to ask himself what this wisdom could be, if he felt he knew nothing. He questioned poets, craftsmen, politicians, and found that they believed they knew, though they could not explain even their own words. As for corrupting the young, Socrates explained, he teaches no one anything. He takes no fees, keeps no school, gives no lessons. He only converses. He asks questions. Those who listen draw their own conclusions. If someone changes, it is the result of their reflections, not his influence. He asked, if he corrupts, then who improves them? Who does that work? None of the accusers could name such people. He did not ask for clemency. He did not seek to avoid the verdict. He said plainly that he would not do what was thought proper for the accused. He would not abase himself to please the crowd. He urged them to consider his life. He had harmed no one, taken nothing from the city, sought no power, deceived no one, told no lies. He said that if they killed him, the city would lose the one who, like a gadfly, stirs a dozing horse, Athens, to move. The vote showed 280 jurors for conviction, 221 against. He was found guilty. The next step by law was to propose penalties. The accuser and the accused each named a sentence, and the court chose between them. Meletus proposed death. Socrates, in characteristic irony, first suggested that, as a benefactor of the city, he be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, as with victors in the Olympic Games. This provoked anger. He then proposed a moderate fine. His friends, Plato, Apollodorus, Crito, rose and declared they would provide surety. But the jurors' mood had shifted. The second vote increased support for death. Now about 360 voted for execution. Socrates heard the sentence calmly. In his final words, he voiced neither bitterness nor malice. Death, he said, is either an endless sleep free of fear, or a road to another world where he might meet Orpheus, Homer, Odysseus, and go on seeking truth. He added that nothing bad can happen to a good man if he lives rightly. He took leave of the court without anger and departed. The trial of Socrates became a turning point not only for him but for Athens. A city that proclaimed freedom of thought proved unready for a man who embodied it to the end. He gathered no pupils, formed no party, sought no power, yet his sheer habit of thinking aloud and questioning the obvious proved too great a threat. And so they chose to silence his voice. After the judges sentenced Socrates to death, the execution was not carried out at once. By Athenian custom, on the day the annual sacred embassy set out for the island of Delos, the city entered a special state of holy silence. Until the ship consecrated to Apollo returned from its voyage, executions were forbidden in Athens, and it so happened that the ship sailed almost immediately after the trial. Therefore, Socrates remained in prison for more than 30 days, awaiting the envoy's return. He spent all those days in the ordinary city prison, without solitude, without cruelty, yet without luxury. His cell was simple, but access to him was open. Each day his close companions came: Crito, Apollodorus, Phaedo, Simmias, Cebes, and others. Plato, as he would later write, was ill and was not present on the day of the execution, yet the memories of those final conversations survived in his dialogues. Prisoners and guards treated Socrates with respect. The jailer who was to hand him the poison later said he had never met a man so calm and so untainted in his attitude toward death. Their talks in prison were not about despair or hatred. Socrates did not curse the court, did not speak bitterness, did not complain of fate. He continued to do what he had always done. He conversed. The themes were the same: the nature of the soul, the meaning of virtue, the essence of philosophy. But now those conversations carried a special depth. They had become final, not as an ending, but as the sum of a long road. In the Phaedo, framed as a pupil's recollection, the day of the execution is described. Yet before that day, there were others, filled with reflections that philosophy is a preparation for death, that detachment from the bodily, from fear and passion, leads to genuine knowledge. Socrates said that death is either the end of perception, like a deep sleep, or a passage of the soul into another form of being where it may continue its path of understanding. He did not claim to know how all is arranged after death, but he did not fear it. He said that a philosopher is one who seeks freedom from delusion, and therefore seeks freedom. One of the most moving episodes concerns Crito's attempt to arrange an escape. Everything was ready: money, help, the road to Thessaly. The guards could be bribed, but Socrates refused. He did not wish to be saved if salvation required breaking the law. He held that he could not accept the city's protection in life and then reject its judgment in death. He said that the injustice done to him did not release him from responsibility before himself. If he fled, he would betray not the city, but his philosophy. On the day the sacred ship returned, nearly all who had been with him in the last weeks came to the prison. It was around noon. The jailer entered and, avoiding their eyes, said the hour had come. He asked forgiveness and said he admired Socrates' steadfastness. Socrates nodded, thanked him, and asked that the poison be brought. Before drinking, Socrates continued to speak. He asked the jailer how the hemlock acted and followed his instructions. The poison gradually paralyzes the body from the feet upward. To hasten its work, Socrates paced a little in the cell. Then he lay down and began to describe what he felt, that first the fingers, then the legs were losing sensation. He asked no one to leave, did not turn away, did not hide his eyes. When he said that the numbness was rising and his breathing was becoming shallow, he spoke his last words, quiet yet clear. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt. What precisely he meant remains a matter of debate. Some think he was giving thanks for a healing from life itself. Others see a simple custom, an offering to the god of healing, a vow to be fulfilled. What matters is that even then, he was not thinking of himself. Within a few minutes, he fell silent. One of the pupils closed his eyes. No one screamed, no one ran from the room, no one began to curse the judges. They stood in silence, some in tears, some in deep thought. Only Apollodorus, unable to restrain himself, burst into loud sobs. Yet even then there was no panic. It was not death as catastrophe. It was completion accepted without terror. Thus Socrates departed, having led no party, conquered no city, built no temple. He simply lived as he spoke, and he died without betraying himself. When Socrates died, there were no public processions in Athens, no official speeches, no graveside recitations. His body was not carried to the People's Square, his name was not spoken in the decrees of the Ecclesia, his likeness was not carved in marble. Yet in private talk, in workshops, on streets, and in gymnasia, his name sounded more and more often, and more, as the name of one lost, not condemned. The city did not stir at once. Officially nothing had changed. The trial was lawful, procedure observed, the sentence carried out without incident. But with time there grew a feeling, vague in some, sharp in others, that something wrong had happened. The death of Socrates did not bring order, did not remove danger, did not strengthen morals. On the contrary, it left an anxious quiet in which the thought of his passing slowly turned into reproach. His friends were the first to act. Crito took charge of the burial. Phaedo went to Elis, where he told pupils the story of the final conversations. Apollodorus, by all accounts, grieved deeply. The most resolute was Plato. It was he who turned Socrates from a man into a philosopher, from a participant in dialogues into a voice that would speak across the ages. Plato began to write dialogues soon after his teacher's death. He did not compose a biography, did not narrate events in detail, did not write treatises. He left Socrates the very form he had lived in, the form of the question. In Plato's works, Socrates goes on speaking, with politicians, poets, sophists, youths, women. He asks, clarifies, drives thought to its limit. In the early dialogues, Apology, Crito, Euthyphro, the figure of Socrates is close to the historical man. In the later ones, Phaedo, Republic, Parmenides, he becomes the bearer of Platonic philosophy. But in all of them, Socrates is the figure who thinks and makes others think. Alongside Plato, Xenophon, soldier, historian, pupil so unlike Plato, preserved Socrates' image. His memorabilia, Apology, Oeconomicus, Symposium, present Socrates not as a metaphysician, but as a moral guide. In Xenophon, he is not a philosopher in the strict sense, but a prudent man reflecting on virtue, education, and public good. This Socrates is simpler, earthier, yet no less sincere, closer to a living person. With time, attitudes within the city itself began to change. A few years passed, and more voices said the verdict had been a mistake. He was judged not for a crime, but for a way of life. He was condemned not for breaking the law, but for being unable to keep silent. Gradually, Socrates himself became a measure, not of how one ought to live, but of how one can remain oneself to the end. History records no formal repeal of the sentence, yet in Athenian memory, it grew burdensome. No one boasted of taking part in the trial. Miletus's name vanished from the sources. Anytus continued his political career, but with a shadow at his back. Later, as Athenian democracy strengthened, the case of Socrates was cited as proof that even a free city can stumble. And Socrates' image went beyond Athens. He was invoked by Antisthenes and Diogenes, Aristippus, and Speusippus, pupils of his pupils. Every philosophical school, Stoics, Cynics, Skeptics, Peripatetics, Epicureans, turned to him in one way or another. Even in disagreement, they argued with respect. He became a beginning, not as a founder, but as a question. In Rome, Cicero called Socrates the first to bring philosophy down from the heavens to the earth, from the stars to the human being. In the Middle Ages, his figure was seen in two ways. Some Christian writers hailed him as a pagan of light, others found him too proud to need revelation. In the Renaissance, he became a symbol of the wise man who can live according to reason. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a hero of individual dignity. And in the 20th century, a voice of inner freedom. He created no doctrine. He founded no school. He wrote not a single line. All that we know comes from others. Yet precisely this made him not a teacher, but an example. Not an instructor, but a memory. He did not become a martyr, for he did not seek to be one. He did not seek death. He simply would not retreat. He did not strive for fame. He simply lived as he spoke. And he left, not in a loud gesture, but in quiet fidelity to himself. So the legend began, not invented, but lived by many generations as an inner experience. Socrates became not merely a name, but a way of seeing, And if philosophy truly begins in wonder, then the first to teach it was he.